Hey everyone, today I'm going to try and answer a question that I get asked often. How do I know how many stitches to cast on for my project? Let's say you've watched a video like my recent video on the half brioche stitch and you want to create a scarf and you're not sure because I've just provided you the pattern for the stitch. I've not really provided a project pattern. You're not sure how many stitches to cast on for your scarf. How do you go about figuring that? That is figured out by determining the gauge. Now, if you pick up any skein of yarn, typically most skeins of yarns will have a label like this. This is not a paid promotion for Karen. In the label, you'll see that it provides the weight of the yarn, but then next to it, there'll be a square that'll have little knitting needles, an icon with little knitting needles on it. Here it's showing US 8, which is a 5mm needle, and it's telling me 18S below it. And what that stands for is 18 stitches. And next to it, it's saying 24R, and what that means is 24 rows. So if I cast on 18 stitches and knit for 24 rows, then it's going to give me a fabric that is 4 inches by 4 inches, or in metric, 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters in size. Now, which stitch are they talking about here, though? They're certainly not talking about the half brioche stitch. Typically, this is for stockinette stitch, which is just one row knit, one row purl, one row knit, one row purl. So if you created a swatch with the stockinette stitch with 18 stitches and knitting for 24 rows, you'll get a 4 by 4 inch or 10 by 10 centimeter square. But how do I know if it'll give me the same thing if I were to do the brioche stitch? Most likely it will not, because the stockinette stitch and the brioche stitch are quite different, right? So what you want to do is you want to create a similar swatch with your yarn that you want to use and the needle size. Now, whichever needle is right for you, get your knitting needles, get your yarn, and create a small swatch in the pattern that you want. Just cast on a few stitches that match up to your pattern. In this case, even numbers, so I've cast on 10. I would suggest minimally do at least 10 stitches. Let's say your pattern calls for an odd number of stitches, then cast on 11 or 13 even. If it's a multiple of 4 stitches plus 2, then 4 times 2, 8, plus 2, 10, you can cast on 10 stitches. And once you've cast on, the stitches per your stitch pattern, go ahead and knit a few rows of that stitch in that pattern. So I have knit here about 6 rows of the brioche stitch. You certainly don't have to knit 24 rows. Knit enough till you get enough of a fabric, right? That's stable and that you can then lay like this. And what you want to do is now measure the width of this. So get a ruler or a tape measure and measure it. And you can see here, I'm measuring it end to end and it's measuring 2 inches. So that's it. I know that if I cast on 10 stitches, I get a fabric that's 2 inches wide. And this is where a little bit of math comes in. When I cast on 10 stitches, I get 2 inches. Let's say I want to make a scarf that's 6 inches wide. So you do have to have an idea as to how wide of a project you want to make. Do you want to make a skinny scarf or a wider scarf? If you want a scarf that's 6 inches wide, so this is 5 inches, 6 inches about this wide, then 6 inches, how many stitches would you need for 6 inches? And the way to do this, I do it by a cross multiplication technique. You can do it by whichever technique works for you, but you multiply 6 by 10, which is 60, and you divide by what's left here, which is 2, and that gives me 30. So if I cast on 30 stitches and do the half brioche pattern, I'm going to get a scarf that's 6 inches wide. For the length, that just depends on your choice. You just keep knitting until you get the length you want. Typically for a scarf, 5 feet or 60 inches is what's standard. Let's say instead of 6 inches, you wanted a scarf that was 8 inches long. So 10 stitches gives you 2 inches. So for 8 inches, how many stitches do you need? It's the same thing. You're going to multiply 8 by 10, that gives you 80, divide by 2, and that gives you 40. But that's it. So that's how you figure out a gauge. Now, again, in a scarf, a gauge is not all that important, but once you know the gauge, then you know the number of stitches to cast on, and then you knit your pattern. But for a hat, it is really important to know the gauge. In a hat, you also have to factor in what's the basic circumference of the hat that you need, because for an adult head, it's about 21 inches. You need a hat that'll fit around a 21-inch head circumference. And so if I was to knit a hat that was 21 inches already, with the stretch, when a person goes to put on that hat's going to be very, very stretchy, and you don't want that. So typically for a hat, you only knit a hat that measures about 16 inches when it's unstretched, because of course, depending on the pattern, some patterns are stretchier than others, but a 16-inch circumference for a hat will stretch to fit a 21-inch head circumference. So for hats, things like sweaters, really important to know the gauge. But for scarves, if you want a basic, how many stitches do I cast? Now you know how to do that. If you still have any questions, please leave them for me in the comments field. As always, thank you so much for watching. Like, share, and most importantly, subscribe. I'll see you all on another one of my Knittycats' Knits videos. Happy knitting!